we're going to be looking at today is we're going to be looking at how critical thinking can be used to analyze your texts. Every idea, theme, and concept in the text is open for interpretation. Nothing is set in stone. Everything can be interpreted. Requires your interpretation not only to understand what it is that's happening in a text, but also to have relevance and meaning to you. For you to be able to engage with a text, it must be able to give you something that you can interpret. So something that you can read, something that you can feel, something that you can think about, a reaction to reading it. All of those things come through just through reading a text, or through watching a film or anything else like that. So if you see a movie and it gives you that feel-good ending at the end and makes you cry a little bit, you interpreting the text and getting that really sad feeling at the end of it, or happy feeling if it's a happy film. This meaning can change in virtually any text. Don't assume common knowledge, because even facts can need to be proven. You can't just say that's a fact, it's true because it's a fact. You need to actually prove it's true. If you're answering a question, you're not just listing facts, you're proving why your answer is correct. For that reason, you can actually choose to ignore some more common analysis, come up with your own. So you don't necessarily have to stick to the tried and true methods of analyzing a particular text. If you're looking at a romance story, you don't have to necessarily say it's a romance story, so I have to talk about it being about love. You can talk about a lot of other things which may be important to the text and may contribute just as much to its meaning as love does. There's not necessarily a common ground on how you need to analyze a text. It is purely up to you. Texts can be analyzed independently, which means they can be analyzed independently not just by you, but they can be analyzed independently of their context and of their author as well. You are analyzing it not off what someone else wants or by the opinions of a lot of different people. You can analyze it purely on what you think. In English, that's what we're trying to get you to do, is to analyze it in your own words, in your own voice, and using your own arguments. I mean, if we wanted you to use someone else's argument, we'd get them to write it. That's not what we want you to do. We want it to be about you, so what you can do. There is no set consensus on how you should analyze a text, only that you are able to justify the how and why in your argument. So in other words, you must be able to prove it. Now, you can use your opinion all you want, but you need to be able to prove it, and you need to write it in such a way where you're using objective reasoning. In other words, you are writing about it in an objective kind of way. You're not putting your own personal opinion in there, or not taking it personally what it's trying to do, but you are including your opinion in such a way that you're talking about what facts are important to the overall meaning in the text. That's your opinion, but you're writing about it in an objective way. I know it doesn't really make sense, but when you're writing an essay or writing any sort of response requiring critical thinking, you need to just do more than provide your opinion. You need to be able to back it up. Being able to back up something with facts is more objective than it is subjective. Even though it is your opinion, you're still writing about it in an objective way, which I know is different from the idea of opinion as such. It's one of those paradoxes that makes English a very interesting subject and confusing at times. You're writing about it in such a way where you're not just saying, I think this is true because. You're saying it is true because. You're using your opinion, just not calling it that. It requires breaking down a text in its key sections, a bit of note-taking, which is always handy, but read it or watch it first, for you to make some clear distinctions. So be able to interpret it in a clear sort of way. So you're not sort of going through and umming and ahhing and coming up with all these ideas that don't make a lot of sense. You've got some clear things that you're talking about and some clear ideas and agendas which are going to be used throughout your critical analysis and your own interpretation of the text. You interpret in such a way that other people can understand it, and other markers particularly, the people who are going to be marking your work, will be able to understand it. First, let's look at construction of story. There is a lot to analyze in just how a story is constructed. The way language and structure are used is important. You might be wondering, okay, how does structure really affect something like meaning? If you think about it, stories aren't really written the same way each time. They're written differently. So your structure is something that from text to text changes, and it does affect the meaning, particularly if it uses things like flashbacks, if it changes the order of which the story is told, if it goes sort of forwards and backwards, whether it starts with a different sort of introduction. All those things, they affect meaning and they make storytelling interesting. But also, they make virtually any text a little bit different and a little bit more interesting and separate from its other texts. What it's doing is, through its structure, a text is able to be independent and be able to stand out on its own. And language, obviously, not only do you read and interpret or watch and interpret language just through the sheer literal meaning of the words or what is on screen, but you can actually get meaning through language through interpreting it in an abstract sort of way, which is to look at it in terms of being critical, in terms of actually working out things for yourself about what they mean, what a symbol means, what a metaphor means, all those things. Both of those things and the way that those stories are constructed help to contribute to the meaning of the text. Next thing is that an author's style, in other words, how an author has put a story together, affects communication. How this author's way of writing or way of putting a film together or whatever the text is, how they've able to shape and affect meaning through that. And that's one of the other things that's related to construction of story. So it's very similar to that idea of how language and structure are used, but it may refer to more stylistic features of a particular author. And particularly if you look at something like Shakespeare, for instance, which you may do quite a lot, Shakespeare has a particular style, and it's one that you'll often be asked to talk about in essays or responses that require you to talk about the style of Shakespeare. Now, some things you might be looking at in terms of the construction of the story is medium, as in, is it a film, is it a poem, what kind of text is it, why does that particular idea, how does medium affect the meaning? A film will tell its story through pictures and through sound. A poem will tell it through images and really abstract terms. A novel or a longer extended short story will use lots of description and a lot of different plot twists and things like that to create ideas and storytelling. So there are lots of different aspects of medium which are different. Next thing is genre. So, okay, is it a sci-fi story? Is it a romance story? What effects does that genre have on its construction of meaning? Does it sort of set it apart? Does it focus on telling a story in a particular kind of way just because it is set inside that kind of genre? The style of prose and poetry. Does it use rhyme? Does it not use rhyme? Is it dark? Is it bleak? Is it satirical? Is it optimistic? Is it all those sorts of things? Plot devices, so flashback, varied narrators, climax, so all those things contribute to meaning as well. Formatting, editing, how it's put together, and particularly in terms of the film, how is it edited? How is it set up? Meaning. Is there anything there where you have to interpret its meaning? How are things represented? All those things you can interpret, and all of these things you can think critically about. By looking at all those things together, being able to take notes on all of these things, you're starting to construct your own critical interpretation of the construction of the story. That's something to look at when you're putting together your response, is looking at being able to interpret all of these things. And on top of that, be able to interpret things like language, for instance. Now, language refers to visual and written techniques, which you would use to interpret a text. You must both think and analyze how and why they are used. In other words, how has the text been written and why has it been written that particular way? And how are visuals used and why are they used in a particular way? So actually really going and focusing on the language individually, as in each sentence, each line, each word. You must constantly challenge the use of such techniques. You must look at particular key sections of the text and look at, okay, why has it been written in this particular way? Why is an action or a setting being described in a particular sort of way? What about this language technique or this sort of visual cue has been placed to shape meaning in some sort of way, in some sort of significant way? Some of the things to look for are emotional imagery, sensory language, all those sorts of things. Language which sort of creates a sense of mood and atmosphere. Metaphor is another one, particularly, especially as one of those really interpretive ones. Visual layout, and particularly if you're looking at a film or a visual text, this is a particularly important one. Camera and film techniques, the same again with visual layout. Dialogue, in terms particularly of a play format, for instance, then dialogue becomes an important language technique that you look at. Contrast, paradox, and juxtaposition, so anything which is compared and contrasted to itself. Any sorts of irony, things that come across through the types of language which are used. Through your analysis of all these sorts of language techniques, you start to get a bit of an interpretation about how a text is put together just through word by word, sentence by sentence, or scene by scene, helps to shape meaning. Again, just like construction of story, you can think critically about all these things, and it gives you a lot of variety. Being critical requires you to be selective, so being selective of all those things means you don't use them all, but you use the ones which are relevant to your argument, and particularly what your argument's asking for. It might only ask you for one of these things to interpret, in which case you've got to focus just on that one thing and not any of these other ones. It also sort of goes to indicate the amount of variety that is involved in analysing language, construction of story, and the next one we're going to look at, which is characterisation. Now, characterisation might not seem such an important point, but it is, particularly when you're looking at character-based stories and the way that characters shape a story. They are a very important consideration for critical analysis, and by analysing how a character is portrayed, you're better able to discuss and to analyse their motives and purpose. Now, characters and stories are constructed in a certain way. They are constructed in a way which is meant to create meaning for the audience. It's not the same as describing a character and what they do. So not saying he's evil. You're writing about how they are portrayed. So he is portrayed as evil because of the fact that he's dressed in black. That gives a little bit more than just simply describing a character and saying he wears black all the time. Well, what does that mean? Is it because he's at a funeral, or is it because he's evil? By actually describing their motives and purpose, and by linking that to the characterization and the mannerisms and all the things that a character does, you're able to analyze them a lot better. Characterization can also be indicated through the voice of the narrator. So the narrator themselves can be a character and something that's definitely worth interpreting when you look at it. More importantly, if you're looking at any other character, or if you're looking at a story which is written in the third person, then particularly description and dialogue are key elements of characterization, which particularly not only can you be critical about them, analyze what they contribute to our connection to that character and how they are portrayed and how we are meant to feel about them, but it gives you some sort of validity to the character's role and their purposes within the story and what you believe a certain character does. Let's look at it this way. When you watch a film, for instance, and I know a lot more of you probably watch films than read books, then some people would look at a character and go, I really like that character because of the fact that he does this and it's really cool. Whereas someone else might go, well, I don't really like him because he has that really annoying voice and it grates on me a bit. And it's pretty much the same sort of thing when you look at it this way. How does the way the character portrayed indicate their role within the story? Is it something that's likable, or is it one of those things that, as your friend might do in this case, is not likable? Obviously, you're not testing whether or not a character is likable in the story, but you are testing their role. And their role isn't set in stone either. It's one of those things that you can interpret. And you can sort of say what their actual role is in the story. You can say that a villain is the hero of the story. It might take a little bit of work. It would take a lot of work, in fact, and it might be very, very hard to argue and justify. It may be a very weak argument, but you can still do it. And that's one of the beauties of the English language, is that you can actually interpret things in completely your own way, provided that you have enough evidence to prove it. And that's one of the tough things about it, is not only do you have to sort of say what you think about that character, you have to prove why that's the case. You can indicate a character and their mannerisms through dialogue, so the way that they talk, the way they speak, descriptions of them. An author or a filmmaker will choose to describe a character in a certain way, so you're made almost to feel about them in a certain way. A character's role, whether they are the hero, or they are the antagonist, or they are the comic foil who always gets sort of caught up in the middle and is the fall guy in a lot of cases. Their relationships, so how they get on with other people. Change in narration. If there are more than one character, or if it's a story with a first-person narrator, does the narration change as that character changes? As that person's opinion on life becomes different. It might be language techniques and their effect on the appearance of that character. So if you describe a beautiful person in an ugly way, why is that done? What does that change about that person? Or that character for that matter? So there are lots of different things there, which again can be interpreted. Now the final thing we're going to look at is theme. Now theme is probably one of the harder ones to interpret because of the fact that it is purely interpretive. Stories won't tell you what a theme is. They won't say the theme of this story is this. You have to interpret them. You have to justify them and argue. Now the thing about them is you can literally write about any theme in a story, provided that you go deeply into it and that the theme is deep enough that you can actually talk about it as having relevance to the story. So if you're talking about a big action movie and you're saying the theme is love because the character falls in love and has a kiss at the end, that's not really a theme that encompasses the whole story. And it's not one that you can really justify as being significant to the story. You need to be very selective of that. Theme can be interpreted for a key idea or effect of the text. So something that sort of goes through, or is the predominant idea of what the text is trying to achieve through its construction, through its characters, and through the language that it uses. Through the combination of all those things, you start to get theme. And it's one of the more integral parts of the critical analysis. Now, there can be ideas relating to things like philosophy and psychology. So you can make a very philosophical statement and say that is the theme. It's trying to make a philosophical statement, or to do with something of the mind or the human experience. It can be feelings. So it can be a sort of emotion that is trying to get people to, whether it be a theme of fear or something along those lines. Personal issues, things like family, relationships, communities, all those sorts of things, and how people relate with their world. So not communities as such, but how people relate to their world. Political, social, so that again, those two ideas all relate to society and the way that society is. Cultural, how cultures are. Things like religious and spiritual sorts of ideas, so to do with people's spirituality, belief in a higher power or afterlife or something like that. Life in its stages, so it might be just about being young and old and the meaning of life, those sorts of things. So there's lots of, again, themes you can interpret. And that's basically it for how to critically analyze a text. So remember, the four main categories of things that you'd be looking to interpret. You'd be first of all looking at construction of your story. So how the story is constructed, how it's put together. Next thing you look at is language, the sorts of language techniques and devices which are used throughout the text. Next thing you'll be looking at is your characters, particularly things like narration and the way that things are detailed. And finally, your themes. And through a combination of all those things, you should be able to construct a fairly detailed analysis of a story and have lots and lots of things to talk about in terms of how you understand and how you interpret a text. Now remember, it's something you do in your own way, and particularly a lot of texts are quite highly interpretive. In other words, they're texts which completely want you to come up with your own interpretation. Think about what they sort of mean to you. Look at the text obviously in isolation first. You watch it and you get your own ideas about all of these things. And then you start to take notes and start to think about some things which are significant to you and which are going to be significant to your answers later on. So that's it about how to critically analyze texts. So until next time, I'll see you later.